Today, we're going to go ahead and I think we can start diving in. I'm going to be jumping in and out. I don't usually join a lot of these review sessions or run them, but because we're sort of continuing the last few paragraphs, I wanted to join just at the beginning before I run off to actually do work, because I have work waiting for me. I just wanted to say I hope everyone's doing well in these wonderfully trying times. We have changed a bit of the settings on the server to keep it more of a safe, contained space. So we thank all of you for joining, as always. And please be involved more. But I think, Jack, do you guys feel like running this session?
Sure.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just mute up, and I will be in and out. Thank you guys so much.
Do you remember where we stopped? That was one thing.
Yes, and let me get my book 2 seconds.
I believe it was page 104 where it says Oedipus depends on this sort of nationalistic, religious, racist sentiment.
So would anyone like to say anything before we start reading? I think the main idea is to read what we did not read yesterday, the rest of the section, and then discuss the whole of the section.
All right, sorry, I am back now. And I think we left on hence the goal of schizoanalysis. Is that correct?
Wasn't it Oedipus depends on this sort of nationalistic, religious...
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. It was. I'll go ahead and read the first paragraph. I've got a few moments. All right. Oedipus depends on this sort of nationalistic, religious, racist sentiment, and not the reverse. It is not the father who is projected onto the boss, but the boss who is applied to the father, either in order to tell you, you will not surpass your father, or you will surpass him to find our forefathers. Lacan has demonstrated in a profound way the link between Oedipus and segregation. Not, however, in the sense where segregation would be the consequence of Oedipus, subjacent to the fraternity of the brothers once the father is dead. On the contrary, the segregative use is a precondition of Oedipus, to the extent that the social field is not reduced to the familial tie except by presupposing an enormous archaism, an incarnation of the race in person or in spirit. Yes, I am one of you. Wow, yeah, maybe I should have had a lot more coffee before we started this. I want to just quickly chat, because when I was rereading this sort of after our chat yesterday and going through this, the line, it is not the father who is projected onto the boss, but the boss who is applied to the father. It feels, I would love to discuss this little moment, either to tell us you will not surpass the father, or you will surpass him to find your forefathers. Does this mean that it's not so much that we're talking about the projection, but actually almost an after-the-fact thing that exists for the subject?
Kind of seems so. They discussed the idea of application earlier.
Yes.
As I remember. But this is a new concept to me that I think they're developing here.
All right. I closed it because of work. Has been fun today. I'll leave it open if anyone wants to jump in.
Yeah, I think Kent's right. This is about how Oedipus is applied and what Oedipus depends on to be applied, right? And so I think it's pretty interesting that you're not projecting the father onto the boss, you're applying the boss to the father, right? Which is a way of getting into a disjunctive synthesis, it seems.
So, Varun, I know in your notes you had, for Lacan, the segregative use of the conjunctive synthesis is a precondition for Oedipus.
Yeah, about that. That's why I was asking Matt a bit, because so I think I'm going to have to review my Lacan for this part. One of the things they're going to say at this chapter is that this idea of segregations and like why almost I think one way to think about it is this sport group rivalries, right? It almost seems like something so ridiculous, but it's taken very seriously. I'm sure Matt would know that in the UK and stuff. But like one way to think about that, I think one of the ways that they're actually making the argument that these divides are happening from like poor uses of this third synthesis. I kind of copied and pasted that part from Lacan because that was something that Zizek had, and so I don't want to 100% say stand with that. I was wondering if somebody else was more familiar with Lacan could help us with that.
Yeah, I haven't run into the term segregation in Lacan.
So the closest I came, because I spent a little bit of time Googling on this, is Lacan.com has a bunch of articles on the sort of normative cases of segregation inside of society, mostly focused around what they're calling the hypermodern family, which is, of course, related to the Oedipal triangle. The family as society's basic institution is a strong value in this country. Still, we have to pay attention to the dislocation of this ideal in contemporary society. Divorce, single parents, composite families, broken families, family violence, and so on. The ideal of the family has its share of failures, but on the other hand, the very dislocation of the ideals of the traditional family that may also give way to innovative solutions that modern psychoanalysis has to take into account. Moreover, tendencies that are either progressive or reactionary contribute to focusing the evolution of society around various phenomena of segregation. Lacanian psychoanalysis stands strongly against any form of the segregative process. So closest I found to anyone directly correlating them in Lacan and segregation. Not apparently a large subject that I'm able to find.
So is segregation the normal meaning of the term, or is this a special technique?
Well, and I'd also wonder if this segregation is the correct French translation, because again, we get into something that is a very complex term specifically. So,
I think it's the if this helps, though, the segregation seems to be the segregation seems to be what allows Oedipus to be had, which is to say, you will not surpass your father, or you will surpass and define your forefathers. And so that seems to be important because that, in and of itself, is a condition for Oedipus to be applied and all that, where they write later on, the segregative use is a precondition of Oedipus, to the extent that the social field is not reduced to the familial tie, except by presupposing an enormous archaism, an incarnation of the race in person or in spirit. Yes, I am one of you. Right, so that's the difference between the father and the forefathers, which has the boss applied to them.
Well, and that then flows. On the contrary, the segregative use is a precondition of Oedipus, to the extent that social field is not reduced to the familial tie, except by presupposing an enormous archaism, old way of thinking, an incarnation of the race in person or in spirit. They're basically saying that basically at the first thing we do is we assume that there is a father. At that point, we become segregative. It's sort of predetermined by even using Oedipus inside of these situations. Is that fair?
I thought the segregative referred to the band of brothers who displaced the father.
Yeah, I think
I'm not sure.
I think you're both onto it. It's the forefathers. It's the band of brothers in the sense of them being so archaic they've endured, right? And so this is the way the choice is going to be made, right? You can't go beyond your father, or you must go beyond your father to your forefathers, which is to get at, right, either a blockage through the father or some sort of enduring race, right? So like there's a lot of examples I could use to illustrate that, but perhaps the easy one is like the Aryan race, right?
Well, and we talked about it before. The concept of segregation in Lacan, I can't find directly related to Oedipus. That's I think the challenge. But the idea of segregation in Lacan is it's always linked to power struggle, history, capitalist discourse, and science. Lacan's quote, "It should be said there is no need for ideology for racism to be constituted. All that is needed is a surplus jouissance that is recognized as such." Lacan states, when he attempts to show that it is precisely the keikon of his own being that the man tries to get at in the object he strikes. The nature of sort of the racism or the dislike is that excess jouissance, the madman trying to get at the object he strikes, we hate the thing so much we want it so much we hate it kind of sort of setup. Coming back to a young man during a session in which he was mentioning again his father saying those guys should all be killed. They were men dressed as women on the side of the road, street walk, prostitutes. In this description, the analyst asked him to describe the complete scene once more. After listening to it, the analyst said, "So the taxi driver had to explain to your father that those people in the street were not women." And the patient answered, "Exactly." After a silence, he started laughing and added, "Oh my God, my father thought they were girls. He liked them." Discovering his father's brutal statement was the effect of an encounter of his own opaque and strange jouissance, and that it was his own horror that drove his irrational reaction of hate of the other, brought the patient relief in the memory. All of this feels applicable because, again, we're talking from the place of the son to the father. The Oedipal triangle feels like we're starting to wrap around the right point. I still can't find anything directly related to Oedipus and this, though. I know excitement. Relax, everyone. Don't get too excited.
Yeah, and if I'm understanding,
bring myself up to speed on where we are right now. That's all.
Good. I think actually we can jump in because the next line literally comes from Lacan, that it's not a question of ideology. That's actually Lacan says that about segregation in Eckhardt's some of his talks. So I'm going to read the next paragraph and then we'll move to discuss a little bit more. It is not a question of ideology. There is an unconscious libidinal investment of the social field that coexists, but does not necessarily coincide with the preconscious investments or with what the preconscious investments ought to be. That is why, when subjects, individuals, or groups act manifestly counter to their class interests, when they rally to the interests and ideals of a class that their own objective situation should lead them to combat, it is not enough to say, they were fooled, the masses have been fooled. It is not an ideological problem, a problem of failing to recognize, or of being subject to an illusion. It is a problem of desire, and desire is part of the infrastructure. Pre-conscious investments are made, or should be made, according to the interests of the opposing classes. But unconscious investments are made according to positions of desire and uses of synthesis, very different from the interests of the subject, individual, or collective who desires. So that actually helps a lot for me to clarify the previous statement. Because we're talking about the way things ought to be, the way that the history of things falls back on everything and subsumes it. C'est rabat sur, right?
It also goes back to what we said, I think it was in the very first chapter, first section of the first chapter, where they talk about the same idea that they reference Reich, don't they? That the real question isn't why were the masses fooled into wanting fascism. The question is, why did they want fascism, right? Because in ideology, there's a kind of there's an element of misrecognition there, right? There has to be. But on some level, that's how ideology as a concept works. But I guess what Deleuze and Guattari are saying against ideology, and they don't really. They don't think the concept of ideology is really useful at all there. The question is why they desired what they desired. And to understand the way in which the social field determines, I guess, the individual psyche, and which can then sort of have its own influence back on the social field as well.
So this seems like what's in the book, What's the Matter with Kansas?
Actually, that's a really appropriate one to bring up, for sure. If anyone's not familiar, What's the Matter with Kansas is a wonderful book about sort of the story of what was once this, I don't want to say lefty, but very collective-based farming state that very hard went far-right, religious, and completely the other direction from where it had been almost 50 years before. And it's a sort of a study into what caused the people to desire this extreme austerity, and they went to extremes. The whole state essentially fell apart and is still falling apart due to the actions of the previous governor there and a few of the mayors. I think that would apply, Kent, because we're talking again here about not necessarily the ideological, underlying things that it's they desire this because they want power. They desire this because they believe it's right. They desire it because of an illusion, because they've been tricked. Right now, we could look very easily at. The poor white rednecks who actually came out as counter-protesters against Black Lives Matter. I think that would be an appropriate thing, because ultimately they should have some level of class consciousness. The material desires that Black Lives Matter are going after are very much the kind of thing that would actually raise sort of all boats, especially that of poor whites. Yet somehow they're fighting against it. And the refrain from the media at almost every turn is either they've been fooled, they believe in some higher power, they've been tricked into it, when in reality, and as I've talked about before, they actually desire to be dominated. They desire fascism. They desire that control over them.
That's why I also posted this Klaus Thea Willett called Male Fantasies, Volumes 1 and 2. It's a study of the fascists before they took over in Germany. There were kind of like novels written by proto-fascists, and so it studies the desire that is represented in those books. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think what's important is to look at the distinction they're making there too, right? Pre-conscious investments are made, or should be made, according to the interest of the opposing classes. So there is some pre-conscious level of libidinal investment going on. However, they write, but unconscious investments are made according to the positions of desire and uses of syntheses, very different from the interests of the subject, individual, or collective who desires. So you have two things going on, right? You have the pre-conscious investments, but you also have a seemingly contrary unconscious investment going on, which I think brings us back to what Matt was saying too, where it's right. It's not that you're applying the father to the boss, it's that you're applying the boss to the father, so as to tell someone you will not pass, or if you will go into the realm of the forefathers.
Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting. I think that this thing of the desires part of the infrastructure, part of that, I think, is the fact that if you have a particular role, then you kind of desire what you think the role should desire. And I think that's the idea of the application of the boss to the father. When the father becomes a boss, then there are certain things that then the father wants as a boss. And this is the idea of roles in society. And Alfred Schutz created a kind of social phenomenology all about this phenomenon.
I mean, so would you describe it as a sort of reciprocal determinism?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think it is interesting that if you take on a role, it's kind of, we have in our society, certain images of what different roles do. But when you're suddenly in a role, then suddenly you have to think about things from the point of view of that role. And so then your response to things change based on that role. So, for instance, new father, a lot of times they will change what they think of things once they realize that they're going to have children.
I wouldn't say that it's deterministic, because Deleuze and Guattari do think that all of this can and should change. So that's probably one important thing. But one thing I was going to say, and this is the only time this episode I will mention Althusser. Just the only take, some context here, is that this was written in a period where a lot of different left-wing thinkers were re-engaging with the concept of ideology and trying to rethink it and understand it in new ways. Gramsci was also, and Althusser, and so on, big influences in this. And it's been going on ever since. How does ideology really work? It clearly can't just be a kind of simple mismatch between objective class interests and your subjective views and things. So this is one of those engagements. It's not a straightforward critique of Marxism in that sense. It's more of a rethinking of how we understand the problem which ideology as a concept was invented to try and explain. Does that make sense? It's rethinking the nature of how we answer the same problem, basically.
Yeah, no, that does make sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that leads us into, it's not just the roles, right? It's the infrastructure with the roles. So as to say that you can take the role of boss and apply it to the father, so as to create the, so as to allow for the, so as to allow for an Oedipal, shall we say, situation, an Oedipal interpretation.
One thing that ought to be kind of mentioned is that, when I say role, and this is the problem with Alfred Schutz, he's seeing roles as ideal types. But the archetypal way of looking at it is, the boss refers to all possible bosses, all the bosses that have actually existed. And so, it's multifarious when it's a complex or an archetype in Jungian terms. It's not idealized behavior.
Yeah, and with that, so Brooks has stepped out to go back to work, so I think it's probably best we move on to the next paragraph and keep the discussion moving. Would anyone like
just before we do, if you want, I can read out. I can read after my point as well. Actually, if you want. Sorry, my last point I was going to make was this line: "It is a problem of desire, and desire is part of the infrastructure." I read that as an implicit critique of a certain approach to ideology, which is what they're kind of discussing in this paragraph, right? Because one way of looking at it would be, but why do people desire fascism? Let's say they do. Right, and you get to the stage where you say they do actually really want it, and then the question is why. One way of explaining that would be, well, it's because of either the economic base or the political, legal, cultural superstructure, which determines these views, right? I think the point of them is that you can't say the reason they desire it is because of this infrastructure. Because, as they say, desire is already part of it, right? So it ends up being circular as an explanation. Yeah, that's the only thing I was just going to say. I can read the next paragraph, or unless you want to say something else.
Yeah, I'll just mention this quick point. I mean, in the Claire Parnay interviews, there's this scene where she asks Deleuze, "Could you like define what were you and Guattari trying to do in that book?" Very simply, since it was kind of it became almost like a meme in France when it first came out. But he said that we understand fascism as lack almost, and so essentially that it's that sense that it's somebody else commands you to want something, and all those lacks are created because the flows of desire are organized differently. So that's at least that's what I read it as.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Right. So these investments of an unconscious nature can ensure the general submission to a dominant class by making cuts and segregations pass over into a social field, insofar as it is effectively invested by desire and no longer by interests. A form of social production and reproduction, along with its economic and financial mechanisms, its political formations and so on, can be desired as such, in whole or in part, independently of the interests of the desiring subject. It was not by means of a metaphor, even a paternal metaphor, that Hitler was able to sexually arouse the fascists. It is not by means of a metaphor that a banking or stock market transaction, a claim, a coupon, a credit, is able to arouse people who are not necessarily bankers. And what about the effects of money that grows, money that produces more money? There are socioeconomic complexes that are also veritable complexes of the unconscious, and that communicate a voluptuous wave from the top to bottom of the hierarchy, the military-industrial complex. An ideology, Oedipus, and the phallus have nothing to do with this, because they depend on it rather than being its impetus. For it's a matter of flows, of stocks, of breaks in and fluctuations of flows. Desire is present wherever something flows and runs, carrying along with it interested subjects, but also drunken or slumbering subjects towards lethal destinations.
I think this is them pretty explicitly saying here that social production, organizes desire in its specific manner, or disorganizes desire in its specific manner. It does both of that to essentially, create lack or excess.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to sort of pass this in my own head. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Would it be fair to say that desire is, in some sense, basic? I mean, they say that it literally constitutes the real, right? It's basic in that sense, but on the other hand, it's always socially managed, coordinated, redirected. Would that be fair?
Could you define what you mean by basic?
Fundamental, there can't be a person who hasn't got, desire. So in that sense,
this was like a debate me and Jack of Hearts were having actually a couple weeks ago, where it's almost like, to some extent, desire for them isn't a first principle, right? Because they say desire occurs before subjectivity, and really, desire is all the. It's almost like their magical energy that gives life everything. Yeah. And so the first time I read that, I was not so sure about that. Like, I was kind of a bit, I was like, that seems kind of odd, right? For someone who talks about rhizomes, suddenly just be like, it's just desire at the very bottom of everything. But it almost works in a similar manner to Nietzsche's will to power. I think that's an easier way to think about it. And
that's how I think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's happening. It's literally everywhere, as you said on the first page.
Yeah.
So it's the very transcendental condition for the possibility of life.
Yeah. So in that sense, it's kind of fundamental or basic, ontologically basic, I suppose you could say, right? But it is always socially managed, socially coordinated. Given a certain character, or pushed in certain directions, or away from other directions.
I think it's always investing, right? Desire is always investing, meaning that's always going everywhere. So it's always going to be connected. I mean, connection is one of their principles. If it's always going to be connected, of course, it's going to reach the social field somehow. And then, that's how the socius gets created. But then the socius works against you also.
Yeah, I mean, even the next chapter when they describe sort of three different sort of formations, sort of social formations, they even in a sort of what they call the quote unquote primitive sort of savage society, what they call it, even then there's still a kind of social organization of the flows of desire even there.
Yeah, and at some level, I see this as kind of what we would have called ideology as being something now called like almost conscious versus unconscious investment or pre-conscious investment. So I suppose ideology would probably be closer to pre-conscious investment. But that seems
there's something. Sorry, would you be able to just clarify for me, as someone who's I've got a little bit of Freud. This was something I'm not so clear on. The difference between the unconscious and the pre-conscious.
I think so. It's not that big of a difference, really. But it's I don't think he changes his like the topological model, right? He changes it a lot over time. But I don't know the way to describe it. It's almost like the pre-conscious is a less unconscious.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the iceberg model is an easy way to think about it, right? You go deeper and deeper.
Right.
And I think it's the more you, I think it might be the more you're repressed, the more like the more repressed something is, the deeper it goes in.
I just like to mention that Daniel Smith, he has this article in which he describes how what Deleuze and Guattari are doing is applying Keynesian economics to Freudianism and Marxism with these stocks and flows.
Yeah, that's an excellent article. I think I've read that before. He's really, I mean, he's got a real knack for explaining things like in super complicated things like super easily. I think I posted a link to Dan Smith's essays on Deleuze, but I highly recommend that, especially for chapter 3 when we talk about flows.
And am I correct in saying that what's happening is unconscious investments, the three syntheses in that, parallel the social dimension, parallel with the socius, so as to allow for what would otherwise be, like, at a personal level, a psychological complex, but more so a socioeconomic complex, which is how you get the kind of, I don't want to call it an apparatus, but the kind of the ways that people like Hitler or the people who sell stocks are able to tap into desire.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key here is that it's desiring production, and so I'll give you the link for that in a minute. Let me just. But so I think the key here is that desiring production is, despite the fact like the nuclear family, what it does is it regulates desiring production into reproduction and general production under capitalism as a separate entity altogether. And for them, desiring production and social production is the same thing, but they differ in regimes. I think that part about differing in regimes is the key word there.
Where do you see regime?
It was a while back, actually. It was on the chapter 1. Chapter 1, the section on a materialist psychiatry.
Oh, yeah, the idea that I had was that it's kind of like an upside down model in some sense. Having desire as being a first principle, because we normally recognize desire as being within some social, macro social situation. And what they're doing is they're saying, no, there's this basic level of desire, which is the desiring machines level. But the other thing that occurred to me was that it's, there's this saying, follow the money. When you're investigating what's really going on, when there's corruption and so forth, it's almost as if their point of view is follow the desire.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to say is that what's so weird and awful about fascism is that that's the case in which desire comes to desire its own repression, right? there's something different there than what you find in other social formations, I suppose. Because in the three kind of societies they outline in the next chapter, desire doesn't desire its own repression, but repression is kind of part and parcel in different ways of how desire produces and is deprived of its product. But I suppose that's what they think is so awful about fascism is that people become but people desire the repression of their own desire, basically, and enjoy it.
And to wrap this up, could we focus on those last two sentences, which read, "And ideology, Oedipus, and the phallus have nothing to do with this, because they depend on it rather than being its impetuous. For it is a matter of flows, of stocks, of breaks, and in and fluctuations of flows. Desire is present wherever something flows and runs. Carry along with it interested subjects, but also drunken or slumbering subjects, toward lethal destinations." What do you guys make of that?
So for me, this is a reiteration of them basically agreeing with Reich again. So the sort of the figures or the figures of psychoanalysis essentially are dependent upon the primacy of the socius, basically, of the social field. It's the way in which capitalism, as a form of society. Sorry, I'm losing train of thought there. Capitalism as a sort of form of managing desire of society in general. That's primary, and after that, that's what produces basically Oedipus. Oedipus is basically impossible for Deleuze and Guattari before capitalism. It's kind of this haunting figure where some of the possibilities were there, but never all of them. Never all of them all at once. They also think capitalism is kind of this ghost from the future, kind of haunting all forms of previous society. The thing which they find every society tries to ward off in advance. It gets very weird and very interesting, but so I think to go back to it, this is basically just a reiteration of that point. But the capitalist social field produces Oedipus, basically. Well, I mean, Nick Land was drawing on a bit of Deleuze and Guattari, and Mark Fisher says the same thing here, and so does Deleuze. So do Deleuze and Guattari. You can read it. They openly write in chapter 3 about how capitalism is weird, like a ghost. I don't know. I'm using my own imagery there, but it's something like that, right? Like this phantom they're trying to avoid.
It's alive, and it's I mean, there's an anti-anthropocentrism that works really well with their poetic understanding of capital. I think so. Like the phallus, I don't think we need to go into that because for Lacan, his rereading of the Oedipus complex has to do with the penis castration and how it goes into symbolic register with the phallus. I mean, is that really related over here? I'm not super well read in Lacan, so I wanted to know if anyone else who's better read than me could sort of help me out there.
I don't know enough. I don't know Lacan in enough detail to be able to answer that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, me either.
All right, you guys want to move on then?
Yeah. Could someone read the next paragraph?
Sure, I'll go ahead. Hence, the goal of schizoanalysis, to analyze the specific nature of the libidinal investments in the economic and political spheres, and thereby to show how, in the subject who desires, desire can be made to desire its own repression. That's completely drawing off Reich. Desire. I think Reich might have even actually used that word before. Desire desires its own repression. Whence the role of this death instinct in the circuit connecting desire to the social sphere. All this happens not in ideology, but well beneath it, an unconscious investment of a fascism, or a reactionary type can exist alongside a conscious revolutionary investment. Inversely, it can happen rarely that a revolutionary investment on the level of desire coexists with a reactionary investment conforming to the conscious interest. In any case, conscious and unconscious investments are not of the same type, even when they coincide or are superimposed on each other. We define the reactionary unconscious investment as the investment that conforms to the interest of the dominant class, but operates on its own account, according to the terms of desire, through the segregative use of the conjunctive synthesis, from which Oedipus is derived. I am of the superior race. The revolutionary unconscious investment is such that desire, still in its own mode, cuts across the interest of the dominated, exploited classes and causes flows to move that are capable of breaking apart both the segregations and their Oedipal applications. Flows capable of hallucinating history, of reanimating the races in delirium, of setting continents ablaze. No, I am not your kind. I am the outsider and deterritorialized. I am of a race inferior for all eternity. I am a beast. I am a Negro.
The way they link up the idea of a death instinct is interesting, though, isn't it? Because they do set up this parallel between the individual and the social field. For them, it's all the same thing in a way, but there's two different regimes, right? That's the way they put it.
There's a lot of emphasis put here on contradictions and how they're understanding contradictions, I think. And I think that's not even just a theme through Deleuze and Guattari, it's a theme through like cybernetics as a whole. But I think one part of when Freud first came up with the Thanatos, it almost seems so contradictory, like why would anyone desire death itself? But I think what they're alluding to here is that, desire has that contradictory element to it, where it can be taken and flowed in different ways, because it's I think the best word to describe it is polymorphous.
Yeah, and I think if we take the word desire as productive, we needn't assume that desire is necessarily creative. It can be destructive as well, right?
And that's the production of destruction. So yeah.
Yeah. But also, this one bit here, those two long sentences about the reactionary and revolutionary unconscious, where you see that there is really, that's still a quite strong influence of Marxism still going on here with Deleuze and Guattari. It's cashed out in a really different language, I suppose, but they're still going to maintain the importance of thinking about interests and classes and domination, and revolution, things like that. That's still really a big part of what they're doing here. They're just sort of using a different framework for thinking about it, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think another thing when they talk about the superior race and the inferior race, I think that's from their understanding of when the conjunctive synthesis is sort of in its parallelistic state or in its misuse construed by psychoanalysis or the nuclear family or a weaker form of social production. Things like, would it be correct to say things like racism, is that derived from that?
Do you mind just sort of saying that again for me?
Yeah, so I mean, they talk about I am of the superior race, this idea of class divide. And I'm not talking about class divide in the Marxist sense, but like, us and them, the divide of one group over the other. I mean, are they, I'm not sure if this is correct, are they saying that it's when the third synthesis is used incorrectly, the synthesis of subjectivity, when it's construed incorrectly by, maybe a weaker form of social production, not understanding where the best way to manage the flows? Is that when something like racism comes from or something?
That sounds right to me. And they also, and this is good, they also therefore wouldn't be committed to saying that, capitalism is the thing responsible for racism, right? Which is kind of a quite reductionist standpoint, because every form of social order has had these sort of underlying misuses of the syntheses of the unconscious, right? They all make systematically illegitimate use of it. It's just for the specific form that it takes under capitalism is Oedipus.
Another way of thinking about this is in terms of nihilism, that these are nihilistic opposites. And the thing about nihilism is that once you recognize the nihilistic thing, then you lose meaning in the world. So, like the classic example is that the Democrats and the Republicans, basically they're all working for the corporations, or working with the lobbyists. And so when you realize that there's not much difference between them ultimately, then if you were a Democrat or you were a Republican and you were fully engaged in the conflict between those two, then when you become disillusioned, you lose meaning in your life and experience anomie. And so one way to think about this is in terms of these are nihilistic opposites that actually, in some sense, are a dualism that is two sides of the same coin. And by the way, you see this in the Oedipus trilogy, where Oedipus is a king. He becomes a pharmacon when he's outcast from his city, self-imposed, and then in Oedipus at Colonus, he becomes the initiator of Theseus's sons to then become kings themselves. So the king becomes pharmacon, and the pharmacon initiates the king.
Right. Okay. I was just reading this again, and I'm wondering if we can interpret this sentence in an actually slightly more ambiguous way than maybe we did at first, or I did. When they say, through the segregative use of a conjunctive synthesis from which Oedipus is derived, I am of the superior race. I don't know if we're meant to necessarily think of that in sort of racialized or ethnic terms exclusively, because presumably part of what we're talking about is the various ways that classes of different kinds form based on this illegitimate use, right? One of them will absolutely be race. The other one, will be class, there'll be gender, and so on. There's all these different kinds, but presumably one way of reading this is to say that what's specific about the reactionary form of unconscious investment is that it makes this kind of segregative use and then privileges one over the other. I am of the superior race / class / gender, whatever, right? And that's possibly why in the next bit, what's specific to the revolutionary unconscious is that it cuts across the interest of the dominated, exploited classes, and causes flows to move that are capable of breaking apart both the segregations and their Oedipal applications. Flows capable of hallucinating history, of reanimating the racist and delirium, of setting continents ablaze. So maybe that's why we're reading it. I don't know. I could be going completely off track there, but maybe when we read, that line there, maybe we could think about it in less, not specifically sort of racialized terms, although that would be one of them, but that what's reactionary is specifically about form of segregative use, and what's specifically revolutionary is the way in which it sort of cuts across them and destabilizes these distinctions and privileges and things.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with you. The one thing I would tack on there is that it's also that that latter, that revolutionary unconscious investment can coexist with the reactionary unconscious investment, which is kind of like what Varun was saying. It looks like a contradiction, but I think it's more just the paradoxical nature that comes with desire, right? Like we talked about with desire, desiring its own repression, or even desiring its own ending. But I would also say like that, what Matt was describing too brings us back to the previous paragraph of, right, you will either, it's not that you apply your father to the boss, it's that you apply the boss to the father in order to tell people you will not surpass your father, or you will surpass and define our forefathers. Matt's right. It's not just race, it's or even class. It's something that you're presuming to be archaic and this sort of ideal, nostalgic, lost thing that you're actually connected with, right? We see this very often in movies where there's this sort of lost race that we're all still connected with, and we just got to find the race. And then that's kind of the reactionary investment. But I think the revolutionary investment would be the one that also comes with like the disorientation of it all, which is to say that you could be experiencing both of these simultaneously.
I think an example to think about is when the British took over India. They were the ones dominating, and they saw all the Indians as children, and they were had their manifest destiny to civilize them, so forth. But also, within that, you got people going native. In other words, sometimes recognizing that the Hinduism was a superior culture. And but the most interesting part is the fact that they discovered Sanskrit was an earlier Indo-European language, and so there was a kinship with the Brahmanism. But not only that, but they thought, because they found all these Buddhist temples that in ruins, they thought Buddhism was the oldest religion among the Hindus, and so they started studying Buddhism to try to find the oldest Indo-European religion to identify with. And so there was this interesting thing where they actually thought that the Indians were them back in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's effectively what they're getting at, is this sort of like, not necessarily a contradiction where things stop, but that sort of paradoxical nature of, yeah, this is who we are. And so like, right, we're either going to repress ourselves and not go beyond the Father, or we're going to go beyond it to the land of our forefathers, right? That's kind of the game of it, as opposed to, this is sort of the socioeconomic complex that they're talking about, that Oedipus relies on, as opposed to making possible. With that, though, are there any final thoughts before we move on to what I think is the last paragraph of the section? If not, would anyone care to read? I would volunteer, but my Wi-Fi went out 5 minutes ago, so.
I can do it if you want.
Do it.
Cool. So we've just read, flows capable of hallucinating history, of reanimating race and delirium, of setting contents ablaze. Yeah. So there again, it is a question of an intense potential for investment and counter-investment in the unconscious. Oedipus disintegrates because its very conditions have disintegrated. The nomadic and polyvocal use of the conjunctive synthesis is in opposition to the segregative and biunivocal use. Delirium has something like two poles, racist and racial, paranoiac, segregative, and schizonomadic. And between the two, ever so many subtle, uncertain shiftings, where the unconscious itself oscillates between its reactionary charge and its revolutionary potential. Even Schreber finds himself to be the great Mongol when he breaks through the Aryan segregation. Whence the ambiguity in the texts of the great authors, when they develop the theme of races, as rich an ambiguity as destiny itself. Here schizoanalysis must unravel the thread, for reading a text is never a scholarly exercise in search of what is signified, still less a highly textual exercise in search of a signifier. Rather, it is productive use of a literary machine, a montage of desiring machines, a schizoid exercise that extracts from the text its revolutionary force. The exclamation "so-its," or the meditation of Iditor on race, is an essential relationship with madness.
I think think this chapter should have. I mean, this section. I think it should have opened with that paragraph because I think that paragraph is a brilliant summary.
Should open the damn book with it.
Yeah, I mean, and it even talks about. I don't know if you guys have read 1,000 Plateaus, but 1,000 Plateaus also opens with this idea that writing is not about. Reading books is not about interpretation. Reading books is about mapping. And Guattari, in his own solo practice, he talked about meta modeling, and that the real I don't want to go super into that. So the real a quick take on meta modeling is that essentially it's like when you're making a schema or you're making something from the unconscious, you have to account for the fact that it's always in genesis, it's always in flux, and it's always becoming. So if you want to read a book in an almost non-representational manner, you have to do a meta model or a cartography of it, which is why I was confused, though. Why was it at that part at the end? But I think when they're talking about the schizonomadic, I think that ties back in the three syntheses together, right? Because the schizo is able to detach from almost these roles of I don't want to say social conformity, but maybe it's that.
So yeah, I'm still trying to think. Sorry, you go on.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, yeah, I could see the schizo as being able to use a more revolutionary unconscious investment. Go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to figure out exactly, the little bit at the end about reading a text is really, really great, really interesting. It's a bit before then, which I'm sort of trying to figure out exactly what it's saying, I guess. I think this is really about the previous paragraph we read, the bit about the revolutionary unconscious, and I think maybe the first few sentences about when he says Oedipus disintegrates because its very conditions have disintegrated. Is what he's saying there that what happens through the revolutionary unconscious is through the breaking up of these segregative uses of the synthesis, it destabilizes the conditions through which Oedipus becomes meaningful, or a figure. Is that the idea? That these kind of nomadic and polyvocal uses are in opposition, but as this revolutionary unconscious grows and develops, because these polyvocal nomadic uses grow, they destroy the essential conditions of Oedipus. Is that what they're saying?
I think partially, yeah. It looks like there's an oscillation for the unconscious where it goes between the racial and the race. Well, where was it? The racist and the racial, which is part of the delirium. So
yeah, would someone be able to explain that one to me?
I'm just going to reread it a bit.
Yeah, I think it's so schizoanalysis is trying to de-Oedipalize psychoanalysis, and one of the tasks of schizoanalysis is to, quote, analyze the specific nature of libidinal investments in the economic and political spheres, and thereby to show how, in the subject of desires, desire can be made to desire its own repression. Right. So in some ways, I think that's part of what the racist is it's that disjunctive, or not that disjunctive, that segregating synthesis that makes you either desire your own repression, which is to say, as previously, you will not surpass your father, so as to apply the boss to your father and keep yourself squared away, or you will surpass and define our forefathers, which is to go on and to arrive at that arcanic thing. So what I see happening in that passage is that schizoanalysis and additionally, the revolutionary investment, I think, too, schizoanalysis has a way of understanding this oscillation between the revolutionary and the reactionary investments, which comes with a way of understanding the conditions for Oedipus and allowing for a change in the conditions so as to allow Oedipus to no longer have a potentiality, and therefore to no longer really be real. But I'll turn it over to someone else.
Yeah, but it sounds like we're about on the same page there, then. That's good.
Yeah, because I think that makes sense too, though, that you oscillate between racist and racial, right? Scherber goes from Aryan to Mongol leader.
I think that one of the ways of thinking about going into the past and into your ancestors is to look for resources. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's on PBS there's this thing about tracing ancestries, and people come in who don't know anything about their ancestries, and then in the show they get revealed to them who their ancestors were and what their stories were. And sometimes those stories are really amazing about what their ancestors did that no one had any idea about. And so sometimes those things that the ancestors did, if you know about them, can be resources for you to use in your own life.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to like what you're describing would be like a kind of literary analysis, that would allow one to sort of read those revolutionary potentials that they talk about, right? Which is to, if I'm reading correctly, like for them, literary texts or literary machines and the act of reading, what you're doing is trying to discover you're trying to perform, there's a desiring production going on. And one of the main thrusts of that is the consuming synthesis, where you arrive at, and that seems to be like kind of what Kent's describing, right? Where if you find this great story, there's this so it's moment. And so there's like, that seems to be for them at least, the purpose of reading texts and trying to figure this stuff out is not so much to buy into the master race, but maybe to discover what the subjectivity being consumed and produced actually is, so as to unfurl it.
So, one of the kind of the main messages that come out of this program that's on PBS about heredity and your own ancestors is on the one hand you have a lot of people who were Jewish that came from Eastern Europe, and so they track back their ancestors to one person who left Eastern Europe, but those who did not leave, because of the programs carried out by the Russians, the whole family, everyone who didn't leave it was killed. And so it's kind of like a horizon of oblivion that where people go back to find the people they're related to, and there's no one left. And another kind of horizon of oblivion that comes out in those programs is Black history, where in the plantation registers only the first name was there, not the last name, and a lot of times no name. So just the age and the age of the slaves in the register. And so there's another kind of horizon of oblivion that comes up with Black in America tracing their history back to slavery.
Yeah, and with that, this seems like a good place to launch. So I think we can safely say we've finished this this section. And so with that, why don't we move right into a general discussion of this section, right, which is the main consummating synthesis. Is there any place anybody wants to begin or has any questions about?
I have some notes. I can just share it into the main discussion chat if you guys want to go off that, or we can go like any way we want. But
If there's no questions, we can just hop right into your notes. So we've got no takers. Varun, do you want to, while you're pulling them up, where do you kind of start out in them?
I start with the connective synthesis, then go to the disjunctive, and then go to the conjunctive. But they're mostly quotes that I pulled from the text and stuff, and I took some of Taylor Atkins' notes, and I got some, and I just added some annotations to here and there.
Okay, well, that's loading for me. Do you want to kick off the discussion?
I mean, I just like to mention that, in the next chapter, there's going to be a recapitulation of the three syntheses. So that's kind of what you've got here is a recapitulation as well.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I was talking to Andrew about this. Do they do that even in the logic of sense? I mean, Deleuze mentions the three syntheses even in the logic of sense, right?
I'm not sure about that, but why don't we focus on the section we just finished? And if anybody wants to ask questions about the other two syntheses, or as they relate, which obviously they will, we can start referencing those other pages. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think we ought to just ask if there's any general questions about this whole chapter first, before we go into these quotes. Does anyone have anything they've got a question about in the whole chapter?
I think that might mean it's time to go right into the quotes.
Okay.
So the first quote Varun gives us is wait a second. Okay, you start in the middle of the chapter section. So why don't we talk about stimuli are not organizers but inductors? That seemed to be something that we was pretty important during this section. So if we go back to page 91, and we're looking at the text, which for me is page 91, hopefully we match. Varun, where did you see the stimuli and the inductors here?
Well, so I wanted to just take note of that, was because I think they give a pretty clear understanding of what they meant in chapter 1 when they talk about the production of anti-production, right? Now, the body without organs, it has one thing to keep in mind is that it has, I think this is really key for this idea of Oedipus registering on the body without organs, right? Is that the body without organs has a paranoiac function and a schizophrenic miraculating function to it. And I use miraculating in the schizophrenic sense because, the schizophrenic has that whole idea of the liberated desire being completely free. And, as they say about Judge Schraber, wanting to be in the endless bliss of life. So the locus on the body without organs construes both the repression and freedom. And I think that's what I wanted to sort of emphasize with that quote there.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, right? It's this weird sign of even what we were just talking about, where it's this way of asking you to repress yourself in some sense, or desiring to repress yourself. But also there's this desire that can be, right? It's kind of disjunctive in there being one or the other choice. Or you can go beyond all that. So it's a weird way of it's a weird way of Oedipus manifesting that way, so as to, if I understand you correctly, so as to connect with the body without organs and produce a kind of subjectivity.
Yeah, I mean, And I think later when they talk about how we're gonna, what's the possible escape and stuff like that, this idea of having both capital's ability to both be beneficial and have repressing qualities to it comes in, right? When they talk about, where's the solution that this book is coming down to? It's the fact that capital can do two things and it has two contradictions. And the same thing with the body without organs, it has two contradictions, where the sort of revolutionary solution can occur.
Yeah, and that's to give kind of a quote. Whence the idea that stimuli are not organizers but mere inductors. Ultimately, the nature of these inductors is a matter of indifference. I think that really relates to what we're talking about too, in the sense that it's not that the stimulus is the organizing factor. That in the same way, right? If we are talking about capitalism, there's all these different stimuli that are occurring in relation to desiring production, where we're able to see all this playing out, and so as to allow Oedipus. But if I understand correctly, with a more revolutionary investment, you could cut across that and find yourself in a different kind of delirium.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the idea of their experimentation comes in. You never know, because everything's becoming, and there's no sort of strict teleology. You sort of never know. It's a very anti-Hegelian idea almost.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. So, are there any other thoughts on stimuli not being organizers but inductors?
One of the things that not about that, but one of the things that stands out to me, in the third paragraph is this: the full body does not represent anything at all. On the contrary, races and cultures designate regions of this body. It is zones of intensities, fields, and potentials. So this is the non-representational aspect of Deleuze's thought coming to the fore here.
Yeah, and that helps us understand the body without organs, right? Because if it has all these different thresholds, all these different zones, and we find ourselves as subjects across it, it is so that we are we understand that we're moving along the body without organs and finding ourselves in the act of consummating consumption with it.
And then a lot of times the idea of the non-representational is seen as effective, that the fact that the body is pervaded by the affect or feeling, not represented as concepts or whatever, but it's kind of a mass type pervasion of the body as a singular.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, because I think one of the most important things about this text is is that it has to be taken with actuality, right? You have to actually go out and apply these things to see how they're working. So it's not that the text is going to represent everything. Once you've understood the text, you understand it. Like they say at the end of the section, right? It's about engaging with the literary machine, so as to do something a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. In Difference and Repetition, one of the main things he's going to try and say is that if everything's always, if it's always a process of becoming, and difference is what's given ontologically rather than identity, and then the things are sort of construed abstractly with something like the Hegelian labor of the negative. But what they're going to say is, since you don't know that, it's all about experimentation.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly. Definitely agree with you and Kemp there. So maybe one thing that might be interesting. Do we want to try and apply some of what we just read to reality and see, like, not the book exists outside of reality, but do we want to talk about how maybe we're seeing some of this in our own lives?
One thing that occurs to me is that the body without organs for the book would be like a blank.
I mean, I think one good example, I think Aildos had a good video on this. I'll try and link it. But he was talking about the protests as seeing where desire is being almost, where desire has been stratified in the protests. Because right now what we're experiencing is, I think in the U.S. is almost a deterritorialization of desire that's going with things. How is the axiomatization of capital going to reterritorialize some of this stuff? I think one way to think about reterritorialization, I don't know if this is a perfect example, but something like Nike advertising. And the way Nike advertising might use like the hashtag Black Lives Matter tag on their Instagram or something.
Yeah, and Aldos, before anyone else comments, since he referenced your video, would you like to say some words? Maybe some sentences?
Yeah, I can hop in if you want. I've been pretty busy lately, so I feel like I haven't been paying enough attention to this section, so I don't want to not give it enough justice. You guys have read it a lot closer than I have the last little while. But I think you're hitting on an interesting point about how sort of maybe some of these things play into deterritorialization right now that are more concrete of a way to think about it. Like, there's clearly desire in some like flow sense being released right now. And like at some point, I don't know if we've read it or not, they say like deterritorialization and reterritorialization, they're almost hard to tell apart at some points. And I think we're seeing that right now, in that like so much stuff is changing, so many things are up in the air. But at the same time, it's always being recorded, right? It's always being kind of reterritorialized on the other side back into something more positive. And right now we are right in that moment of deterritorialization where the reterritorialization hasn't happened. So we're kind of right in like this exciting moment where like all these possibilities that Deleuze and Guattari really are trying to flesh out are kind of like living, they're active, they're in front of us.
I think the reterritorialization is beginning, though, in the sense that not just the marketing sense that Varun mentioned, although I'm sure I'm not the only one who's received emails or even seen talks that are, that kind of side with the protests, but don't necessarily come out and say that, or maybe the opposite. Mm-hmm. But also, I would say where you're seeing some reterritorialization is there is legislation going through right now to try and make it more difficult, if I'm not mistaken, for cops to have the kind of protection that they, in prosecution, that they currently have, which I think is a form of, correct me if I'm wrong, a form of reterritorialization and the appeasement of all the protests.
Yeah, I would think that would be a pretty clear example of deterritorialization, reterritorialization, where certain like deadlocks, like right at the beginning of the book, right, they talk about machines and how everything is a machine and everything is about like these stops and starts of flows. And then here they describe like what flows are. It's desire, right? Desire and flows, they're the same thing. Desire is like this constant moving, active element of the infrastructure that pushes things along. And right now, like companies, when they're trying to cater or to make an advertisement that plays off this stuff. It's trying to set up their machine in a way that they can direct that flow of desire, to take advantage of it, to put it into a productive use, right? So companies are the very first ones to scramble and actually be able to try to take advantage of this, just in that raw profit sense, right?
Yeah, because what they're selling is not just a commodity. They're also, as I think we're learning in this section, they're selling a kind of subjectivity to be consumed and consummated through. At least in terms of a socioeconomic complex, I think that's pretty accurate to say that if you don't consume a product related to this, right, how much of a protester are you? Or vice versa. I mean, the interesting thing here is it's not one-sided, right? You have both protesters and people who are doing other things who want this to end, right? If I'm not mistaken, that's a kind of paranoiac machine.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, but it's also hard because, again, they say it's hard to tell these things apart. So we see one side as deterritorialization and the other as reterritorialization, but how much of that is a symbolic sort of difference is something that I never quite got to the other side of with Anti-Oedipus. I still have that question lingering in my mind, is how definitive can we actually get on separating these two the two poles?
I think it's more about trying to take things and apply I think it's more about taking the instances. So that's why I'm saying, the protesters have this going on, but there are people who aren't protesting who have different things going on. And as you start to do that, you can start to build the relationships to make a larger critique, or rather, to make a larger diagram of how this stuff is, how the different relationships have flows in between them, where anti-production is occurring, and where different not only recordings are occurring, but also different subjectivities and different machines being plugged in by different people.
Yeah, and the idea of a revolutionary subjectivity is one that I don't know, I'm thinking about that. It sounds like a really interesting idea. I like how revolutionary subjectivities are being produced and whether those are authentic, considering how much they're mediated by capital and media and stuff like that.
So I just like to mention that, sometimes you can see live helicopter footage where they're flying over the city and they've got these telescopic lenses, and so they'll focus on one group that's doing one thing and another group that's doing other things. And both the people and a lot of times the looting is going on in one place and the protest is going on in another, but sometimes they're mixed together. And but you can see that both of them are mass phenomena in the kinetic sense of crowds in power. They're masses of people operating together to do different things, whether it's protest or it's vandalism. And so, but you get this kind of bird's eye view where the camera will go from one scene to the other scene and back to the other scene, and then it'll go search for another group of people who are doing something else. And so you can see that the dynamics of the crowds are very different.
Yeah, and this is like we were talking about earlier with the body without organs having different terrains, different thresholds. Kind of like what Ken is saying, it's not static in any way. Although it looked like you had something to say there.
Oh, no. I mean, I could keep talking if you want. I think that Kent was making an interesting point there about sort of the two opposing sides and how it's all being recorded in its own sort of sense through media and like the camera, right? I right at the very beginning, when all this stuff started happening, right when the Target was being looted, there was a video that came out of somebody beating up a woman in a wheelchair in front of the Target, and then everybody had a big reaction to it, and then moments later, the fuller video came out of her stabbing people shortly before that point, right? And I like, so much of this stuff, like, it's being recorded, but at the same time, like, that recording isn't like definite. It's only recorded, like it only exists insofar as it exists as a territorialization on that body without organs, right? But in a moment like this, day to day, that territorialization is changing. So it is that experimentation part of like, what is going to be the most effective way to funnel these desires, to put them into a machine, to put them into a productive sense. Is it going to be rioting? Is it going to be looting? Is it going to be, police coming in and enforcing curfews? Is it going to be people going out and protecting their shops? Like, these are all like different social machines that are all like coming together spontaneously on the body. And it's that experimenting, like seeing which one is going to win out, which one is going to actually be more effective in its production, I guess.
So another thing to think about in terms of the nihilism is that, with coronavirus and these protests or riots or whatever happening at the same time, you get these nihilistic opposites of people segregating themselves, protect themselves from the virus. And then, it goes to the opposite extremes where people are getting together in groups to protest and completely ignoring the fact that that may exacerbate the action of the virus. And so, that's an example of these nihilistic extremes that the American culture seems to produce, and is producing even more extremes right now than, it usually does.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
I find it kind of... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I really like your point, too, about the recording. But it's not just the physical recording. It's that either or that comes with it, right? So in some ways, right, I think it's fair to say that there's a series of either ors that you encounter when you're watching these different videos. In a different way to kind of illustrate the point, a friend of mine was arguing with another friend about this, and his position was, well, how is this different than like the Boston Tea Party? Right. And so then it's kind of an either or in the sense that, well, either it's the Boston Tea Party or it's something else, right? The way that recording carries forward. And at that point, you have you can almost see the protesters and in some ways the cops and the business owners, and some more so the cops probably, becoming the British, and the protesters becoming the people throwing the tea off the ships, right?
I mean, the either or of the recording, it's more about potentials, right? I mean, the either or is more about the locus of freedom that's on the body without organs. So, you're not stuck in this paranoid or neurotic stage of repeating the same connections. You can switch connections by choosing one of the either or, and that's how like sort of capitalism functions, right? When something like some crisis like this occurs, right, it can recapitulate itself from advertisements and can subsume everything inside it by going either or. So we can just change this thing to just change that thing, and that's how it sort of survives in its own miraculation.
One of the things that people forget about the Boston Tea Party is that that was also an example of where people had enough with the taxation from Britain, because they were taxing everything. And like, for instance, even window. If you go to England, you see a whole bunch of windows that were bricked up. And that was because people didn't want to pay the window tax.
Yeah, and that sounds like part of the pre-conscious investment to me that Begum is talking about in the chat. where it's the sense of, things like class and that can begin to emerge. And Aldous, I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off earlier. What was it you were trying to tell us?
I don't remember what the point was, to be totally honest.
Well, you've disappointed my children and I.
Sorry. Yeah, I do think though that this whole example gives us so much like to work with. It's a very beautifully Deleuzian example, I think, because it does have that spontaneity, but at the same time, like every single side, every single ideology, everybody's trying to like there's all this talk about the narrative, right? And like I often think about like the narrative and that same idea of like recording, like with a story that holds up, the story that we accept to guide our actions. And yeah, it's changing every day. Like the story that we hear every day, every minute, it's just sort of in flux.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. The narrative is part of is in some ways what's at stake for the recording, just like Varun was saying, where like the schizo is able to perform genealogies of recordings so as to write their own recordings, right? And in the same way, I think it's important too that that also leads to the consummating consumptive synthesis, right? Because
it's because of this beauty that you have both the recording and memory in the body without organs. It's because of that beauty that it's kind of beautiful to think that it's just because of that it has both freedom and repression potentials.
Yeah, and it's from that then you can say, and that's what it was. Or I'm sorry, so that's what it was.
Well, that's when the two forces almost attack each other, right? I mean, the third synthesis is, the way I understand this, very similar to Nietzsche's will to power, where there's the impulses, and there's sort of resolution of one impulse, and then you get the identity is one really small thing that's almost misunderstood as the whole process. It's things like the nuclear family and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Because there are always multiple, for Nietzsche, there's always multiple impulses acting at once, but it's the only one that gets selected at the particular moment.
Now, do you think, because I do remember the section you're talking about where it's attraction and repulsion. If I remember correctly, it's not so much the two poles that determine the subjectivity as isn't there something kind of above that? Although I might be, maybe it's my recording process that's gone haywire here.
I mean, can you rephrase the question a bit?
I give it a shot. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it is consummating consumptive synthesis? Does it arise from an attraction or repulse that sort of wins over the others, or is there something else that goes on?
It's something similar, but it's more of a. I think one way to think about it is it's a fight between the two impulses, and it's sort of, and then do they see the erotic machine yet? I can't remember, but one of them gets chosen.
Yeah, and I pulled up this section. It looks like, to me, it looks less like one of them gets chosen and more like the resolution comes from the celibate machine, which functions as the return of the repressed.
The return of the repressed is a Lacanian term. I mean, it has to do the return of the repressed specifically for Lacan has to do with this idea of displacement. But I mean, it's what I think the key there is this whole idea of it being retroactive.
Yeah, I think that makes. Oh, go ahead, Altos. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think Freud talks about return of the repressed as far as like the uncanny goes in Heimlich.
Yeah, I think you guys are right. It's not only Lacan, but I think Lacan appropriates it for dissociation, but I'm not sure.
I actually need to sit down and read Lacan. I'm behind there.
Yeah, I think there's something to do with displacement for Lacan when the subject sort of displaces itself.
I was reading here. I thought this was. Sorry, go ahead.
Nope. You first.
Okay. I was just reading that. Trying to tie it back into something you were saying here, talking about like flows breaking apart segregations in their Oedipal applications, capable of hallucinating history, and it reminded me a little bit like you were saying, the either or. That's the disjunctive synthesis, right? The synthesis is always going to trip me up. Anyways, that this comes into the whole idea of like previous revolutions and the Boston Tea Party, right? Is this the Boston Tea Party or is it something else? And it reminded me a lot of a photo I saw of somebody just at one of the demonstrations had brought a guillotine. And it was just like this group of people all standing around really casually, like with this guillotine, and like, you know, it was in like a shopping mall, like strip mall. You could see like corporate signs in the background and stuff. And it was this weird moment of like where those people for that moment could almost say like, I am Robespierre, you know, like even if they aren't, there is that moment of like hallucinating history that's going on that I think, yeah, you can really see it in some of the attitudes, especially among the more revolutionary types.
Yeah, and you don't even have to go that far back, right? One of the big things that I've been hearing, and I've actually like kind of made this argument too, is that it's not just the most recent act, right? You've got Trayvon Martin, you've got I just lost his name, Rodney King, the Watts riots. It's not like all this stuff gets forgotten, right? And you can see it out there. One thing to tack on too is because you made the point about Robespierre, or the Robespierre effect, right? At the end of I don't know if you guys have seen Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie, but I think this is, if you have, you'll probably know where I'm going with this. At the end of the movie, all these different people, kids and adults, stand up and say, I am Malcolm X, after X has been killed. And I think in some ways it's kind of what you see in certain instances here, is people finding these kind of these different subjectivities, these different feelings that are left over, that have both been recorded and now, like Varun said, as things go a certain way as they have before, they're coming back again. The return of the repressed is as we mentioned.
Right. So in a way like that, the previous events, they remain sort of as that repression that comes back through re-recording or re-territorialization or something.
I'd say another recording, right? Because in each situation, different things happen. So I think it's fair to say, like, there's a way of treating these riots, these protests, and that, as has been done before. But there's also, like, I think this might be the first time, at least in my life, if not this past century or so, that the military has been called in.
Yeah.
So it's not just like, it's not like the same thing is happening over and over. It is more so that, like they said later on, so that's what it was, right? Is we see it again, sure, but at the same time, desiring production continues, so new recordings are being made.
Yeah.
New syntheses.
I sorry to interrupt you, but I think that the whole point about saying so that's what it was, it's not only that the fact that it's retroactive, but more importantly that it's you don't pick your desire chooses you almost. It's a very Nietzschean transvaluation.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily like your desire chooses you, but like you are the investments of your desire, those libidinal investments. Like the self is simply, it's a matter of more libidinal investments than it is someone telling you something, right? It's how it's actually recorded, it's how it's drawn, it's how the flows actually move. Like desire in itself it doesn't tell you anything. All it does is move, right? But what tells you something is how that desire is used in a productive fashion.
Yeah, and I think it also relates to like, so right, in some ways we're the handymen plugging in our different machines, but it's also the fact that machines have their own desires, right? And so like, I would say more so, I think Varun would be right insofar as like, you and how you plug in your machines is how you both give way to and interact with your different with desiring production, both because it's not just at a personal level, it's also at a social level.
Yeah, I think that's where that whole really cybernetics idea comes from, right? That everything's almost connected to a certain degree, and that's why things like that's why despite the fact that capitalist institution would segregate social reproduction from desiring production or something like that, it's all still connected to each other, and they can both influence either regime. I mean, I think they're drawing off a lot of like people like Norbert Wiener, Gregory Bateson there.
Yeah, I think the cybernetic aspect of this, it's something like Nick Land makes a big deal out of, but I think a lot of people brush over it a little bit because there is so much going on in here that sometimes the like explicit cybernetic stuff can kind of fall to the side.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you guys have read Deleuze's essay, Postscript and Societies of Control, what he means by control there comes from actually Norbert Wiener's understanding of control from his cybernetics.
This might be kind of off track, but I just have a small question. When they talk about the two poles, right? The paranoia and paranoiac, segregative, and schizoanatic, they say racist and racial. And like what that distinction is. The anthropological parts of this book were always the ones that I got hung up on the most. So like their analysis of racial and race, racist and racial there, I'm still not 100% on. I don't know if that'll come up more or if we've already gone over that.
I mean, this is what me and Matt were also trying to figure out between each other when we were talking about this and even talking about it before, is essentially how is it that I don't know if this is a perfect example, right? But the football team that hates the other football team, how is it that something like that can occur? And I think the argument that they're making is that Oedipalized subjectivity creates these divides, and but I'm not sure exactly how to put it rightly in their terms, as you say, with the racial and race groups.
They say racist and racial, whatever that means.
For those interested, we are on page 105 in the Penguin spine-breaking edition.
Yeah, I mean, my cover to the Penguin's ripped out already.
Yeah, that right there for you folks is an example of anti-production. But that being said, Aldous, I think you have a great question there, because that's what, like Varun said, Matt and us were talking about it. And so I think...
I don't know how much I agree with Brooks's example. When Brooks brought up Lacan and his theory of... I couldn't really see a relation with Lacan and Deleuze at that point. What about you guys?
Specifically with the racial racist thing?
Yeah, because I don't really see many connections with Lacan there.
I'm not sure I recall.
I think the problem is that this term of segregation in Lacan, he was saying he couldn't find many references to, but I think that toward the end, it seemed like segregation meant, breaking things apart into different reified sets of peoples.
But I guess, like, what is the difference in breaking people apart based on racist grounds, and what's the difference between breaking people apart on racialist grounds? Right? Like, you would think that you could do both. I would assume.
Well, one of them would be the exclusive disjunction. I don't know, do you guys know the exclusive disjunction? It would be a use of that instead of an inclusive instance where you can be either or, but an exclusive use of like someone mentioned the football teams earlier. Right, so it's the exclusive, that's a paranoid investment of desire, would be the exclusive use of the disjunctive synthesis. It's saying that, well, this other person on the other team is like totally exclusive from me, and then there's that racialized antagonism, whereas really it's mostly, I mean, from the desiring machine point of view, it's pretty ambiguous whether or not one team is better than another, or whether one race is better. I mean, races don't even align well on biological characteristics. It's just a sort of paranoid investment of desire. But what they want to say is that it's mostly driven by some social, it's like driven by some social or economic needs. But it's that use of the exclusive disjunction, definitely.
So racism would be the exclusive side of it, whereas racialism would be the inclusive side of it.
I think so, yeah. You guys are talking about the anthropology in like the third chapter. That stuff can be tricky just because there's they're referencing a lot of Levi Strauss, the jeans guy. And like there are some other conversations about why Strauss is so like obsessed with exchangism. And he's got some own things that he's got his own ideas that are trying to preserve for structuralist anthropology. But Deleuze and Guattari are kind of going to smash some of that, at least when we get to that chapter. I mean, they're going to talk about like inscription and the socius. So yeah, it's like an exclusive use of the disjunction, which is like a paranoid investment in desire.
That was really helpful. Thank you.
And to build on that, if we're oscillating between those 2 points, that would explain the delirium, right? Where even with like a football team, right? I am on the best team, but we're all still teams, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and it's also explained. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari are just explaining it in terms of these two poles. So it's like they're interested in only to what degree does this investment of machines or energy lead to, like, what does it do? I mean, this is the cybernetic aspect someone brought up earlier, was that cybernetics is like, you don't ask what it is or what it means, you just ask what it does. So when you're looking for the different machines, or, you know, people might have their own verbal explanations of why they like one team over another, but really if you look at the machines, you can have a sort of materialist explanation, and it's going to be, yeah, so your investments of desire either align on more or less schizophrenic and inclusive, or paranoid and and exclusive. Slip those up there, but it's very different than what Lacan and Freud are doing, which is, this person likes Chicago Bears. Like, how does this mean that the Bears have the phallus, or that how does the coach represent the father? Instead, D&G are like, well, desire doesn't mean anything. It just machines what it machines because it wants it. And we can only analyze it in terms of, well, does it make the situation more, like, is it more paranoid, or is it more schizophrenic? Is it making connections, or is it really concerned with breaking them and preserving some sort of neurotic unity which doesn't really exist? And of course, this will piss off Lacan to no end.
I mean, I think that's exactly what the critique of representation is in this book. The fact that it's not what something means or what something is, but rather what something does or has the potential to do, with the body without organs, perhaps. And I think that's what as soon as we start getting into introduction to schizoanalysis, that's what they're going to start talking about. That, you know, like I think one of the best examples is when they talk about Kierkegaard and how they stopped defining God. Like you look at Kierkegaard and what they did, they stopped defining God as some sort of essence, right? They started saying, no, there's the capacity to believe for God to exist, and that's faith. And you see a similar thing with Marx, and they say Marx with Adam Smith and Ricardo, when labor as a possibility or an axiom for understanding wealth was discovered. You look at the possibility to have, or the potential to have wealth. And that was not representationality. I think that's why they like Freud's concept of the libido so much, right? Because Freud didn't have any like sort of objet petit or any lost object that of a representation that something was searching for. It was just before Freud began looking into things like the Oedipus. It was just the capacity to have desire, and that's libido.
That is so true. Yeah, the critique of representation. It's going to touch on Lacan, Freud, and especially Marx, because it's like that's like a meta way of doing like philosophy. I mean, all of these systems kind of have like a manifest versus latent dream content, and that kind of aligns onto like the superstructure and base for Marxism, which is the idea that, well, there's a representation, and that stuff's just not real. We can ignore that. And then go into, well, there's a more real level, which is the economy, or which is the unconscious investments of desire that are determined by Oedipus. And Deleuze and Guattari are going to say, like, hell no, like, I'm not going to trust you the fucking doctor to interpret what the signs mean and what the reality is. Instead, we can look at the signs and interpret them like a genealogy written on the surface. You know, we don't have direct access to what it means, as if it's like, forget all that.
Yeah, and I see too where you were getting that's about like the exclusive and inclusive, where they like delirium as something like two poles, racist and racial, paranoid, segregative, and schizonomadic. So it's also to say too that in the inclusive, you're also able to continue on the nomadic path, right? So there's also seems to be this notion of like motion there, where the schizonomadic can continue moving, whereas the paranoid segregative has to stop and split. And yes, we are just about out of time, so I will open the floor for final thoughts.
Well, this was a interesting chapter. It took us a long time to get through it. 3 different sessions to reading it, 3 different review sessions. So I think we've done good work here, and I'm looking forward to the next chapter section.
Have we cracked the schizophrenic egg? This is why you can't take blood room. And so with that, thank you all for joining us for this final reading of section 2.5. Please join us again Monday for our continued reading of section 2.6. Also, we will be having a movie night Friday at 7 p.m. PDT with a showing of David Lynch's Eraserhead. And then finally, Saturday we will be discussing William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell at 12 p.m. PDT. And Sunday, Simone Dunn will continue at the same time, 12 p.m. PDT. So bring your friends, bring your popcorn, and bring an inquisitive mind.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Love you all.